Big Pharma has a horrible reputation. Countless court cases have revealed how Big Pharma has misled doctors and harmed patients, all in the pursuit of maximizing corporate profits. Since Big Pharma makes the most money when patients are ill, the industry wants you to be sick. It's a hard pill to swallow, but it's the same as how the industrial military complex wants there to be war. An industry that is built around producing weapons wants there to be a demand for those weapons. Similarly, an industry that is designed to develop medicine for the sick has little interest in eradicating diseases, as simply put, this would be bad for business. Having worked in the pharmaceutical industry myself for almost a decade, I've asked myself the question if Big Pharma is really as evil as it is perceived by the public and portrayed in the media. That's when I stumbled over the New York Times bestseller called Bad Pharma, written by Ben Goldacre. Ben is a physician and scientist at the University of Oxford, and his debut book, Bad Science, sold over 500,000 copies and reached the #1 spot in the UK non-fiction bestseller charts. As you can tell from the title of his book, Ben can't exactly be described as an advocate for Big Pharma. In fact, he's probably one of the most outspoken critics of the industry, which brought in just over $1.5 trillion in global revenue back in 2022. In his books, he makes some valid arguments on why medicine is broken, which I'm going to cover in today's video. In particular, I will cover the 7 key aspects that Goldacre criticizes in his book and give you my admittedly quite biased perspective on these aspects. With that out of the way, let's try to understand what makes Big Pharma so evil in Goldacre's view. One of the big themes that Goldacre covers in his book is that data suddenly goes missing. By coincidence, it appears that it's usually unfavorable data which disappears. The first chapter of his book has the subtitle "Sponsors Get the Answer They Want," which implies that pharmaceutical companies withhold negative or inconclusive results from clinical trials, publishing only studies which show their drugs in a favorable light. This obviously causes problems, as selective reporting skews the evidence base that clinicians rely on for medical decision-making, which leads to an overestimation of a drug's efficacy, and in the worst case may conceal harmful side effects of medications. Selective reporting bias is a phenomenon that has plagued the pharmaceutical industry for many years now, as highlighted in a publication from 2003, which found that studies which showed significant effects were published more often than studies with non-significant results. While I don't disagree with Goldacre on this issue, it has to be mentioned that publication bias and selective reporting is an issue that affects all of science, meaning that the problem is not unique to the pharmaceutical industry. That being said, publication bias in medicine has the potential to be hugely impactful, as it may cause inadequate resource allocation and may even lead to dire consequences for patients in the real world. Next up on the list of evil practices which Ben Goldacre accuses Big Pharma of is that they purposefully design bad clinical trials. There are many ways in which a trial can be bad, so here are some of the examples from Goldacre's book. First up, we've got outright fraud. It really shouldn't surprise anyone that the fabrication of false results is a bad thing. Researchers that make up results supposedly with the self-interest of drawing more attention to their own research should undoubtedly be ashamed of themselves. Apart from something that's as obviously bad as fraud, there are more nuanced aspects in which a trial can be flawed. This is where we venture into the more grey territory, which may or may not be acceptable depending on the circumstances. These less obvious but potentially still problematic aspects include trials that are too short, too small, or trials that test against an inappropriate comparator drug. In Goldacre's words, you just need to test your drug against something that's rubbish to look good. This is quite common in the pharma world, as new drugs are often being tested against placebo. Such a placebo comparison can still be appropriate, for example in the absence of available treatment option for a disease, but it becomes less relevant when there's other active, proven drugs available for the indication. Goldacre goes on to talk about many more tricks that pharma companies use to make their new drug look good, such as testing their drugs on ideal patients that are more likely to get better anyways, bundling outcomes into so-called composite endpoints and changing thresholds for effect estimations, or swapping the primary outcome to something else, or even designing trials to include a long list of outcomes. You may think that there's nothing wrong with adding more outcomes that you want to test in your clinical trial, but think of it as rolling a single die for a moment. Each additional outcome or endpoint tested in a clinical trial is like rolling another die. The more outcomes you test, the higher the chance of finding a statistically significant result just by random variation, even if no real effect exists. Another type of analysis that's prone to random variation is subgroup testing. If you endlessly slice and dice the patient population of your clinical trial, chances are that sooner or later you'll find a group for which your treatment is beneficial. Apart from selecting the most beneficial subgroups, pharma companies are also masters in framing the outcomes of clinical trials. For example, we know from research that the way in which risk outcomes from clinical trials are framed will impact decisions, whereby people are more easily persuaded when evidence is presented in relative terms rather than absolute terms. If I tell you that a drug reduces your risk by 50%, especially without mentioning the baseline risk, it sounds very dramatic. If I instead tell you the absolute risk reduction, saying that your risk goes down from 2% to 1%, this would be much less emotionally impactful, even though both statements confirm the same information, just with different framing. Moving on to our next item on the list of what's wrong with Big Pharma is the lack of transparency. You would believe that something as important as the results of pivotal clinical trials for essential medicines that patients take in the hope of improving their health outcomes, sometimes even risking severe side effects, should be available in the public domain. Well, turns out you're wrong. Almost all clinical study reports are only shared when absolutely necessary, for example, for the purpose of regulatory submissions or health technology assessments. And even when they are being shared, they're usually marked as commercially in confidence, meaning that some information is not visible for certain stakeholders. In his book, Goldacre gives the ridiculous example of a pharma company that got forced to release clinical trial data to make them available to independent researchers to validate the claims made by the drug company. Goldacre then goes on to explain how instead of simply sharing the CSR as a PDF file, the pharma company provided the documents in the form of scanned images of the pages, which meant that the data could easily be searched, analyzed, or even copy-pasted. It is those kinds of stories that shine a very bad light on Big Pharma. And I can tell you from my personal experience of having worked in the industry now for a while that I've not come across a single company willing to share their study reports with the public. While Big Pharma certainly has no interest in making all clinical trial results freely available to the public, it's not like they don't want to make some noise. In fact, they really want to make as much noise as possible, as long as it is in their favor. That's why Big Pharma uses marketing to communicate what they think is important. It's a well-known but still startling fact that Big Pharma spends about twice as much on marketing as they do on research and development of new drugs. Luckily, direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs is heavily restricted or outright banned in most countries around the world, which is a good thing. That leaves the question though what all of the marketing budget is spent on. The answer is healthcare professionals, or HCPs for short. While Big Pharma can't advertise to you and me directly, they can still advertise to treating physicians, nurses, and pharmacists. To do so, Big Pharma has come up with the job of a drug rep, which is essentially a traveling salesperson who goes out to hospitals to promote a company's drug. The reality is that many physicians rely on drug reps to get their information on the latest drugs that come to market in their respective field. You can see why this might be problematic. In an ideal world, physicians would read all the latest publications that become available, staying up to date that way, not needing to rely on external advice so that they can draw their own independent, objective conclusions. Unfortunately, though, this doesn't really work. In a 2004 research paper, a group of academics showed that the time needed for a physician to keep up with the primary care literature is estimated to be more than 600 hours per month. This means that a primary care physician would need to spend more than 20 hours a day just to read the latest medical papers, which for obvious reasons isn't feasible. That's why physicians rely on drug reps, which introduces bias. As shown in a paper published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which goes by the fitting subtitle, "Is a Gift Ever Just a Gift?" researcher Ashley Wazana concludes that physician-industry interactions have an impact on prescribing behavior. This of course only just confirms what thugs that have dealt illegal drugs on the streets have known for eternity, which is that the first one is always free. In fairness to Big Pharma, though, this exact behavior, known as seeding the market, i.e. giving free product to physicians, is not allowed anymore. But still, pharma sales reps are out there impacting drug prescription patterns for better or for worse. And it doesn't stop there. Pharma companies are known to have paid celebrities like Jon Bon Jovi, Kim Kardashian, or Magic Johnson to advocate for their drugs, which at best represents a delicate balancing act of raising public awareness and at the worst could be interpreted as misleading and potentially even harmful advertisement. Advertising like this becomes especially dangerous if the claims made in those advertisements are not backed up by evidence. One way in which pharma companies advertise to physicians is via placing ads in scientific journals that are only read by an educated audience. However, a systematic review assessing those journal ads found that less than 67% of the claims made were supported by high-quality evidence, and that 2 studies found that less than 28% of the claims made were actually unambiguous. It's not just the excessive and sometimes false marketing that puts Big Pharma in a bad light. It's also the way in which the industry takes advantage of the underfunded regulatory apparatus. Because of massive backlogs in regulatory filings combined with limited capacity and staff to critically appraise drug company submissions, regulatory bodies can be forced into a position where they have to rely on the evidence summaries provided by the pharma companies rather than conducting their own independent analysis from scratch. It's like letting a student grade their own exam. What could possibly go wrong? Cases like this are of course extreme outliers, but there's a second issue beyond the funding problem. This second issue is that the regulatory industry as a whole is very small and there's only so many people who've got the expertise to conduct regulatory assessment procedures. When you pair that with the fact that the pharma industry pays much better than government-funded regulatory institutions, you find yourself in a situation where regulatory professionals are incentivized to work for Big Pharma directly after gaining experience working for bodies like the FDA or EMA. Take the example of Thomas Lundgren, who was the head of the European Medicines Agency from 2001 to 2010. Immediately after leaving his role at the EMA, he began advising pharmaceutical companies through a consultancy business that he set up called Pharma Executive Consulting Limited. While setting up a limited company and making a career shift is of course perfectly legal and understandable, critics argued that his transition to work for Big Pharma undermined public trust in the impartiality of regulatory bodies. After all, Lundgren must have gained valuable insights into the inner workings of the EMA, and who better to consult if you've got an interest in navigating these complex regulatory processes using potential loopholes to your advantage. And it doesn't even end here. Not only do regulatory bodies have a problem with attrition of key personnel to go to Big Pharma, it's also the secrecy that surrounds them. If you think about it, there's no one really to check the work of regulatory bodies. Yes, they're meant to be independent institutions that protect the public from potentially harmful medicine, but there's also no easy mechanisms in place to question or at least read up on regulatory submissions. It's also the fact that many regulatory submissions nowadays are based on surrogate markers in an effort to save time and money where it would otherwise take too long to measure if a treatment works or not. Such indirect measures like blood pressure or cholesterol levels can be a great early sign that a treatment is effective, but they still need to be validated and followed up on to see if the outcome that actually matters to the patient, like longer survival or improved quality of life, actually occurs. In this context, Goldacre criticizes regulators for being too lenient and not holding pharmaceutical companies accountable for proving the real-world benefits of their new treatments after pharmaceutical companies have received marketing authorization based on the promise of such surrogate markers alone. A related point Goldacre raises regarding accountability of Big Pharma is that they hire ghostwriters to give their publications additional credibility by piggybacking on the names of well-respected academics. Not only does Big Pharma benefit from the association of leading experts with the drug that they want to promote, it also creates a conflict of interest when doctors and physicians have financial ties to the industry. The worst case of this would be where pharma literally writes a paper only to then hand in the full full manuscript to a renowned researcher to put their name on it. What's so bad about this relationship is that oftentimes researchers are incentivized to do this, not even because of the money. The thing is that researchers are often measured by how many papers they publish and how often those papers get cited. Therefore, if Big Pharma offers you to do the work for you, potentially helping you to advance your academic career, many scientists are willing to make the sacrifice. It's a bit like outsourcing your homework in 4th grade to the smartest kid in your class, and then you win a science fair with it just because everyone knows how clever that kid is. Just like how the smart kid gets to present their homework at the science fair, Big Pharma leverages ghostwriters to influence medical guidelines and policies by shaping the agenda of congresses, forums, and scientific discourse, which in turn finds its way into written recommendations for the use of medical interventions, usually in favor of Big Pharma drugs. While ghostwriting is pretty common in the pharma industry, Goldacre also covers rarer and admittedly even more outrageous examples of why Big Pharma is so evil. One such rare but moving story is related to the ethical concerns of drug testing in low-income countries, where pharma companies, presumably thinking that they could get away with it, have conducted clinical trials by exploiting vulnerable populations, all in the name of research, often with inadequate oversight and informed consent processes. These ethical concerns are compounded by the fact that the benefits of the research rarely reach the local populations who are exposed to the risks of the clinical trials. This is because new drugs tend to follow the money, which means that countries with healthcare systems that present a lucrative commercial opportunity for Big Pharma are prioritized, and hence countries like the US or major European economies tend to get access to new medicine first, whereas low-income countries often need to wait much longer to get access. It's always easy to voice criticism, so let's instead have a look at the solution that Ben Goldacre proposes to fix medicine. The main ask from Goldacre is for better data, which is also the title of the conclusion of his book. To make data better, we first need to make sure that we're getting the full picture. Missing data is a key problem in medicine and research in general. Even now, in late 2024, more than 12 years after Big Pharma was first published, academic journals still have a tendency to publish positive findings more often than they publish negative findings. And yet, both findings are equally important. Closely tied to missing data is the lack of transparency. Making clinical study reports, statistical analysis, and cost-effectiveness models freely available to the public may very well contribute to better medicine. Apart from these broader system-level recommendations, Goldacre also gives some actionable advice to everyone who isn't part of the healthcare industry. For example, he suggests that the next time you go and see your doctor, you can ask them if they accept hospitality from drug companies. Similar to that, he suggests that doctors should post a list of the interactions they had with industry in their waiting rooms, and I personally would find that absolutely hilarious if they had to do that. So where do I stand then, as someone who works in the pharmaceutical industry? Do I think that Big Pharma is evil? Well, I certainly find it hard to argue with many of the points that Goldacre raises in his book. To be honest, his arguments are well researched and based on sound evidence. And yet, I don't think that Big Pharma is as evil as it is perceived in the public. I know I said it in the beginning of this video that Big Pharma wants you to be sick, and that is true, but it's also the industry that develops life-changing drugs that help make the lives of countless of people on this planet much, much better. If you've ever looked into how difficult it is to develop new medicine, it's dazzling to see that any of the molecules that we test in the lab actually work in patients. Yes, Big Pharma is driven by commercial interests, and there certainly needs to be regulation to keep that in check. But I do wholeheartedly believe that this is the best way we know of to develop innovative new medicine. Now, if you want to learn more about the journey a new drug takes from the lab to find its way to the use in patients, then you should check out my video on the topic that you can see on screen right now, and I will see you in the next one.